In the shadowy halls of Blackthorn Manor, a storm rages as wealthy Reginald Harcourt is stabbed in a locked study, his chilling toast to truth still echoing. Only Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed village spinster, can unravel the deadly plot. In one night, as secrets of greed, betrayal, and a forged will surface, she spots closing smudges, a hidden panel, a staged scream that point to a cunning conspiracy. With the clock ticking, Miss Marple traps the killers, saves the innocent, and brings justice before midnight. Dive into a mystery where no secret can hide from her keen mind. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The late afternoon sun painted St. Mary Mead in soft gold, slipping through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cosy cottage. She sat by her window, knitting a pale blue scarf, her fingers moving, with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Her sharp eyes, though, weren't on the needles. They darted to the garden, where sparrows hopped along the stone path, and beyond, to the quiet village street. St. Mary Mead was peaceful, but Miss Marple knew better than most that peace could hide secrets. A sharp knock at the door broke her thoughts. She set her knitting down, smoothed her grey skirt, and shuffled to the door, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the wooden floor. Outside stood Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper from Blackthorn Manor, a grand old house just outside the village. Mrs. Ellis's face was pale, her hands twisting a crumpled handkerchief. Her dark eyes flicked nervously, like a rabbit caught in a trap. "Good evening, Mrs. Ellis," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but curious. "What brings you here so late?" Mrs. Ellis swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mr. Harcourt, he's my employer up at the manor, he's asked for you to come to dinner tonight. It's urgent, he says. I don't know why, but he was firm about it." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Reginald Harcourt was a wealthy widower, known for his gruff manners and tight grip on his fortune. She'd met him once or twice at village events, where he'd grumbled about modern nonsense and sipped his tea with a scowl. An invitation from him was rare, and an urgent one even rarer. Something wasn't right. "Tonight?" Miss Marple asked, glancing at the clock on her mantel. It was nearly 5 o'clock. "That's rather sudden." "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Ellis said, her voice low. "He's got guests coming, his niece, Clara, and some others. I think, well, I shouldn't say, but there's trouble brewing. I feel it in my bones." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. She'd learned long ago that housekeepers, like village gossips, often knew more than they let on. "Trouble, you say? Well, I suppose I can manage a last-minute dinner. Tell Mr. Harcourt I'll be there by 6. Mrs. Ellis nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll send the car for you." She hurried off, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Miss Marple closed the door and returned to her chair, her mind already working. Blackthorn Manor had a reputation for being grand but gloomy, with its tall stone walls and ivy-covered towers. Reginald Harcourt wasn't the type to throw parties for fun. If he was gathering people tonight, there was a reason, and Mrs. Ellis's nervous twitch suggested it wasn't a happy one. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her thoughts were far from the scarf. She was thinking of a time, years ago, when a sudden invitation to tea in St. Mary Mead had led to a scandal over stolen silver. Sudden invitations, she knew, often hid big secrets. By 6 o'clock, Miss Marple was ready. She wore her best black dress, modest but elegant, with a pearl brooch pinned to her collar. Her grey hair was neatly tucked under a small hat, and she carried a knitted shawl over one arm. The car, a sleek black Rolls Royce, arrived promptly, driven by a young man who barely spoke. As they wound through the narrow lanes toward Blackthorn Manor, Miss Marple gazed out the window, noting the darkening sky. A storm was coming, she thought, and not just the rainy kind. The manor loomed ahead, its windows glowing like eyes in the dusk. It was a hulking building, all sharp angles and cold stone, with a heavy iron gate that creaked as it opened. The car rolled up the long driveway, past tangled rose bushes and a fountain that hadn't worked in years. Miss Marple stepped out, thanking the driver, and climbed the wide stone steps to the front door. Mrs. Ellis was there to greet her, looking even more frazzled than before. "You're here, thank goodness," Mrs. Ellis whispered, taking Miss Marple's shawl. "They're all in the dining room already. It's tense." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, dear. I'm sure it'll be a lovely evening." But her eyes were sharp, taking in the grand hallway with its dark wood, paneling and flickering chandelier. The air smelled of polish and something else fear, perhaps. Mrs. Ellis led her to the dining room, where a long mahogany table was set with gleaming silver and crystal. 5 people were already there. Voices hushed as Miss Marple entered. Reginald Harcourt sat at the head, a tall man with a stern face and grey hair slicked back. His dark suit was impeccable, but his hands gripped his wine-glass too tightly, and his eyes darted to the door. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, standing. His voice was gruff, but there was a flicker of something relief, maybe, in his expression. "Good of you to come on short notice. Please, sit." Miss Marple took a seat near the end of the table, her small frame almost lost in her backed chair. She smiled politely, but her eyes were already scanning the room, taking in the others. To Harcourt's right was Clara Vernon, his niece, a pretty young woman with auburn hair and a worried frown. She kept glancing at the man beside her, James Thornton, her fiancé. James was handsome, with a boyish grin, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. Across from them sat Mr. Pettigrew, the family lawyer, a thin man with a pinched face and round glasses that glinted in the candlelight. He was scribbling in a small notebook, his lips pressed tight. And at the far end was Miss Vivian Lyle, a glamorous actress with golden curls and a red dress that seemed too bright for the somber room. She sipped her wine and smiled, but it was a sharp, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. The table was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath. Mrs. Ellis bustled in with the first coarse scream of mushroom soupand. The clink of spoons was the only sound for a moment. Miss Marple took a small sip, her eyes moving from face to face. She'd seen this before in St. Mary Mead, when old Mrs. Carter had invited her whole family to tea and then announced she was selling the family farm. The air had felt just like this, thick with secrets and resentment. "Miss Marple," Harcourt said suddenly, breaking the silence, "you're known for your sharp mind. I thought you might enjoy meeting my little circle tonight." His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing her. Miss Marple smiled, her voice soft. "Oh, I'm just an old lady who likes a good chat, but I do enjoy meeting new people. Tell me, Mr. Harcourt, what's brought everyone together tonight?" Clara's spoon clattered against her bowl, and James shot her a quick look. Pettigrew's pen paused, and Vivian's smile widened just a fraction. Harcourt leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "A family matter," he said, "and a business one. I've been thinking about my will, you see. Time to make some changes." Clara's face went pale. "Uncle, please," she said, her voice shaky. "Not tonight." James put a hand on her arm. "Clara's right. Can't we just enjoy the meal?" Harcourt ignored them, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. "You've seen a lot in this village, haven't you? People hiding things, pretending to be what they're not. I thought you might understand." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression gentle but her mind racing. She remembered young Tommy Pierce, who'd lied about stealing apples to cover up a bigger secret. Harcourt was hinting at something, but what? "People are often surprising," she said carefully, "but they're rarely as clever as they think." Vivian laughed. A sharp, tinkling sound. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're delightful. Like a sweet old granny with a knife hidden in her knitting bag." Her eyes sparkled with mischief, but there was something cold behind them. Pettigrew cleared his throat. "Let's not get dramatic, Vivian. Mr. Harcourt, perhaps we should discuss this privately later." "No," Harcourt snapped, his voice like a whip. "It's happening tonight. I want everything out in the open." He raised his glass, the red wine catching the light. "To truth," he said, his voice heavy. "May it come to light before the night is over." The room went still. Clara's hands shook, James frowned, Pettigrew's pen scratched faster, and Vivian's smile froze. Miss Marple sipped her soup, her heart steady but her mind buzzing. She thought of Mrs. Carter again, how her bold announcement had ended in a shouting match and a broken vase. But this felt different, darker, more dangerous. Harcourt's toast wasn't just words. It was a challenge, maybe even a warning. Mrs. Ellis returned to clear the plates, her hands trembling as she avoided Harcourt's gaze. Miss Marple noticed a tiny tear in the housekeeper's apron, as if she'd caught it on something in her haste. She also saw how Clara kept twisting her napkin, how James's eyes followed Vivian, and how Pettigrew's glasses kept slipping down his nose. Little things. But Miss Marple knew little things could mean everything. As the main course roast beef and potatoes was served, the storm outside began to rumble, distant thunder rolling over the hills. The chandelier flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Miss Marple felt a prickle at the back of her neck, the same prickle she'd felt years ago when she'd walked past the old mill and heard a cry that wasn't quite human. Something was coming tonight, something bad. She leaned toward Clara, her voice soft. "My dear, you look troubled. Is everything all right?" Clara started, her eyes wide. "Oh, it's just family stuff. You know how it is." Miss Marple nodded, but she didn't believe it was just family stuff. She'd seen too many family stuff excuses in St. Mary Mead, from stolen jewelry to secret affairs. She glanced at Harcourt, who was watching her, his eyes hard blue. Chapter 2. A toast and a threat. The dining room at Blackthorn Manor felt like a storm waiting to break. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier's flickering light, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the guests. Jane Marple sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap, her grey eyes moving from one person to another. The roast beef and potatoes sat heavy on her plate, barely touched. She wasn't here for the food. She was here to watch, to listen, to piece together the puzzle that Reginald Harcourt had laid out with his strange invitation. The clock on the mantel ticked towards 7 o'clock, its steady rhythm almost drowned out by the low rumble of thunder. Outside, the storm was getting closer, and the air in the room felt thick, like everyone was holding their breath. Harcourt sat at the head of the table, his stern face flushed from the wine. His dark eyes glittered as he leaned forward, gripping his glass. Clara, his niece, sat stiffly to his right, her auburn hair catching the light as she stared at her plate. Her fiancé, James Thornton, kept a protective hand near hers, but his jaw was tight, his boyish grin gone. Across from them, Mr. Pettigrew, the lawyer, pushed his glasses up his nose, his pen still scratching in his little notebook. Miss Vivian Lyle, the actress, lounged at the far end, her red dress bold against the dark room, her smile sharp as a blade. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, moved like a shadow, clearing plates and refilling wine glasses. Her hands shook as she poured, and Miss Marple noticed a bead of sweat on her forehead. The poor woman was scared, but of what? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Baxter back in St. Mary Mead, who'd trembled the same way when she'd caught her employer hiding stolen money. Fear like that meant secrets, and secrets meant trouble. Harcourt cleared his throat loud enough to make Clara jump. "I've had enough of this tiptoeing," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "You all know why you're here. No point pretending." Clara's head snapped up. "Uncle, please," she said, her voice small but sharp. "Can't we talk about this later, in private?" "No," Harcourt said, slamming his glass down. Wine sloshed onto the tablecloth, a dark red stain spreading like blood. "It's happening now. I'm done with secrets." James leaned forward, his face red. "Mr. Harcourt, with all due respect, this isn't the time. Clara's upset and upset." Harcourt cut him off, his laugh cold. "She should be. You all should be." He turned to Miss Marple, his eyes locking onto hers. "Miss Marple, you're a woman who sees things clearly. Tell me, what do you make of families who hide their true feelings?" Miss Marple smiled, her voice soft as a whisper. "Families are like gardens, Mr. Harcourt. They look pretty, but there's always something growing under the surface weeds, maybe, or something worse." She thought of the time young Lucy Hale in St. Mary Mead had smiled at her brother while plotting to sell his prized horse. Smiles could hide thorns. Harcourt nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. "Exactly. And tonight, I'm pulling those weeds out." He stood, raising his glass high. "I've made a decision. My will, my fortune, it's changing. Clara, you've had your chance, but I'm done waiting for you to prove yourself. Someone else will get what's mine." The room went still. Clara's face drained of colour, her hands twisting her napkin into knots. James's mouth opened, but no words came out. Pettigrew's pen stopped, his glasses slipping down his nose again. Vivian's smile froze, her eyes narrowing like a cat spotting prey. Mrs. Ellis, standing by the door, dropped a spoon, the clatter loud in the silence. Miss Marple sipped her water, her heart steady, but her mind racing. She'd seen this before. In St. Mary Mead, when old Mr. Grayson had threatened to cut his son out of his will. That night had ended in broken dishes and bitter words, but Harcourt's tone felt darker, more final. She noticed the way his hands trembled, not from age, but from anger or fear. She wasn't sure which. "Uncle, you can't mean that," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I've done everything you asked. I've stayed here, looked after you, looked after me," Harcourt snapped. "You've been waiting for me to die, you and that boy of yours." He jerked his head toward James, who bristled. "That's not fair," James said, his voice low but firm. "Clara loves you. We both want what's best for you." Harcourt laughed again, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "Best for me, or best for your bank account?" He turned to Vivian, who was watching with that sharp smile. "And you, my dear, don't think I don't see your game. You're not as clever as you think." Vivian's laugh was light, like bells, but her eyes were cold. "Oh, Reginald, you're so dramatic. I'm just here for the company." She winked at Miss Marple, but the wink felt like a mask, hiding something sharper. Pettigrew cleared his throat, his voice thin and nervous. "Mr. Harcourt, perhaps we should discuss this in my office tomorrow. Legal matters are best handled." "No," Harcourt barked, cutting him off. "No more delays. I've made up my mind. Tonight you'll all know the truth." He raised his glass again, his hand shaking so badly that wine dripped onto his cuff. "To truth," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "May it come out before this night is over." The toast hung in the air like a storm cloud. No one raised their glass. Clara stared at her uncle, tears in her eyes. James gripped her hand, his knuckles white. Pettigrew scribbled something in his notebook, his face pale. Vivian sipped her wine, but her smile was gone, replaced by a hard, calculating look. Mrs. Ellis backed toward the door, her apron twisted in her hands. Miss Marple watched it all, her face calm but her mind buzzing like a beehive. She thought of Mrs. Carter's tea party in St. Mary Mead, when a bold announcement had sparked a fight that revealed a stolen necklace. Harcourt's toast wasn't just words, it was a spark, and this room was full of dry tinder. She noticed little things, the way Clara's fingers shook, the way James's eyes flicked to Vivian, the way Pettigrew's pen moved too fast, like he was trying to hide his thoughts. And Vivian, her calm was too perfect, like an actress playing a part. Mrs. Ellis returned with desert apple tart, with cream, but no one seemed hungry. The plates sat untouched, the silence growing heavier. The chandelier flickered again, and Miss Marple glanced at the windows, where rain was starting to patter against the glass. The storm was here, and it wasn't just outside. "Mr. Harcourt," Miss Marple said gently, breaking the silence, "your toast was interesting. Truth is a funny thing, isn't it? Sometimes it hides in plain sight." She smiled, but her eyes were sharp, watching for reactions. Harcourt looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. "You understand, don't you? You've seen people lie, cheat, pretend." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, nodding. "In St. Mary Mead, we had a young man who swore he was at church when he was really stealing apples. Lies don't last long, not when you look closely." Harcourt's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Then look closely tonight, Miss Marple. You'll see plenty." Clara pushed her chair back, her face flushed. "I can't listen to this anymore. Uncle, you're being cruel." She stood, her hands shaking, and James jumped up to follow her. "Sit down." Harcourt roared, his voice shaking the glasses on the table. Clara froze, then sank back into her chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. James sat too, his arm around her, glaring at Harcourt. Pettigrew adjusted his glasses, his voice tight. "Sir, this is unwise. You're upsetting everyone. Let's finish dinner and enough," Harcourt said, waving him off. "I'm not a fool, Pettigrew. I know what's been going on behind my back." He looked around the table, his eyes hard. "You all think you can outsmart me. You're wrong." Vivian leaned forward, her voice smooth as silk. "Reginald, darling, you're scaring poor Mrs. Ellis. Look at her, she's shaking like a leaf." She glanced at the housekeeper, who was hovering by the door. Her face white dot. Miss Marple followed Vivian's gaze. Mrs. Ellis was gripping her apron so tightly, her knuckles were pale. She looked like she wanted to run but didn't dare. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Baxter again. How she'd known about her employer's secrets but stayed quiet out of fear. Mrs. Ellis knew something. Miss Marple was sure of it. The clock struck 7, its chime sharp in the tense room. The chandelier flickered again, and the rain outside grew louder, hammering the windows. Miss Marple felt that prickle at the back of her neck, the same one she'd felt when she'd walked past the old mill in St. Mary Mead and sensed something wrong. Harcourt's words, his toast, his trembling hands, they were building to something. She didn't know what, but she knew it was bad. She glanced at the table again, her eyes catching small details. Clara's napkin was torn where she'd twisted it. James's wineglass was untouched, his hand still on Clara's pettigrews. Notebook had a smudge of ink on the page, as if his hand had slipped. Vivian's red dress had a tiny thread loose at the sleeve, like she'd caught it on something. And Harcourt's cuff was stained with wine, but there was something else. A faint mark that looked like ink. To dot Miss Marple folded her hands, her smile as gentle as ever. But her mind was sharp, sorting through the clues like pieces of a quilt. Harcourt was stirring up trouble on purpose, she thought. He wanted a reaction, maybe to catch someone in a lie. But why? And why invite her, an old lady from the village, to witness it? As the dessert plates sat untouched, the storm outside roared louder, and the chandelier flickered one last time before steadying. Miss Marple took a small bite of her tart, her eyes never leaving the table. Something was coming, she could feel it, and when it did, she'd be ready. Chapter 3. The scream in the dark. The air in Blackthorn Manor grew heavier as the storm outside roared, rain lashing the tall windows of the dining room. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her small hands folded over her napkin, her grey eyes sharp despite the soft smile on her lips. The dessert plates apple tart with cream sat untouched, the tension from Reginald Harcourt's toast still hanging over the table like a dark cloud. It was just past 8 o'clock, and the chandelier's light flickered, casting uneasy shadows across the faces of the guests. Clara Vernon, Harcourt's niece, dabbed her eyes with her torn napkin, her face pale. Her fiancé, James Thornton, sat close, his hand on her arm, his jaw tight. Mr. Pettigrew, the lawyer, scribbled in his notebook, his glasses glinting as he glanced nervously at Harcourt. Miss Vivian Lyle, the actress, leaned back in her chair, her red dress stark against the gloomy room, her smile gone but her eyes watchful. Harcourt himself sat at the head of the table, his wine-stained cuff visible as he gripped his glass, his stern face set in a grim line. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, hovered near the door, her hands twisting her apron, her eyes darting like a frightened bird's. Miss Marple sipped her water, her mind buzzing. Harcourt's talk of changing his will and his cryptic toast about truth had stirred up trouble, just as she'd expected. She thought of a tea party in St. Mary Mead, when Mrs. Carter's bold words about selling her house had led to a shouting match and a stolen brooch. This felt worse, though Harcourt's anger was too sharp, his eyes too knowing. He was pushing someone, or everyone, toward a breaking point. Mrs. Ellis cleared her throat, her voice shaky. "Shall I bring coffee to the drawing-room, sir?" she asked Harcourt, her hands fumbling with a tray. Harcourt waved her off. Yes, let's move. I've had enough of this table." He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The others followed, their movements stiff, like actors in a play that was about to go wrong. Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing her black dress and adjusting her pearl brooch. She noticed Clara whispering to James, her face tight with worry. James nodded, but his eyes flicked to Vivian, who was gliding toward the door with a sway in her step. Pettigrew tucked his notebook into his pocket, his fingers brushing a smudge of ink on his cuff. Miss Marple filed that away, remembering A.S. Mary Mead, shopkeeper, who'd hidden a forged receipt with a similar smudge. Little things, she knew, could mean everything. The drawing room was just across the hall, a large space with heavy velvet curtains and a roaring fire in the grate. The storm's thunder rattled the windows, and the chandelier above flickered again, making the shadows jump. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned armchair near the fire, her shawl over her lap, her eyes taking in the room. The furniture was grand but worn, the air thick with the smell of old wood and wax polish. A portrait of a stern woman, Harcourt's late wife, perhaps hung over the fireplace, her painted eyes seeming to watch the guests. Harcourt stood by the mantel, pouring himself a brandy from a crystal decanter. "Sit, all of you," he said, his voice gruff. "We're not done talking." Clara and James took a sofa, sitting close, their hands clasped. Pettigrew chose a stiff chair near a side table, his notebook out again. Vivian perched on a velvet stool, her red dress catching the firelight, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Ellis bustled in with a silver coffee tray, her hands shaking so badly the cups rattled. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile, but the housekeeper barely met her eyes before hurrying out. "Mr. Harcourt," Miss Marple said gently, "you've got us all curious. What's this truth you keep talking about?" She kept her tone light, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any twitch or glance that might give something away. Harcourt's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "You'll see soon enough, Miss Marple. I invited you because you notice things others miss." He looked around the room, his gaze hard. "Some people here think they can fool me. They're wrong." Clara's voice broke the silence. "Uncle, please stop. You're scaring me." Her eyes were wet again, and James squeezed her hand. "Scaring you?" Harcourt snapped. "You should be scared, girl. You and your precious James, always whispering, planning. That's enough." James stood, his face red. "You can't talk to her like that." Vivian laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "Oh, James, don't play the hero. It doesn't suit you." Her words cut like a knife, and James's face darkened. Pettigrew adjusted his glasses, his voice thin. "Let's all calm down. Mr. Harcourt, perhaps you should." The lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering fire. A piercing scream tore through the air, high and sharp, making Miss Marple's heart jump. It came from somewhere near Bather Hall, maybe, or the study next door. The guests froze, their breathing loud in the sudden silence. Thunder crashed outside, shaking the windows. "Stay where you are." Harcourt's voice boomed, but it was unsteady, like he was as shaken as the rest. Miss Marple gripped the arms of her chair, her mind racing. She thought of a night in St. Mary Mead when the village hall's lights had gone out during a dance, and someone had slipped a stolen watch into a coat pocket. Darkness, she knew, was perfect for hiding mischief or worse. The lights flickered back on, dim at first, then steady. The chandelier glowed, revealing the guests' pale faces. Clara clutched James's arm, her eyes wide. Vivian stood by the window, her hand on the curtain, her face calm but her fingers tight. Pettigrew was half out of his chair, his notebook on the floor. Harcourt was still by the mantel, his brandy glass empty, his face grey. "Where's Mrs. Ellis?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but firm. The housekeeper was gone, and that scream hadn't sounded like her usual nervous fidgeting. "I'll check," James said, starting toward the door. But before he could move, Mrs. Ellis stumbled into the room, her apron twisted, her face white as chalk. "It's Mr. Harcourt's study," she gasped. "I heard the scream and looked ho. It's awful." Harcourt pushed past her, his steps heavy. "What are you talking about, woman?" The others followed, Miss Marple moving quickly despite her age, her shawl trailing behind her. The study was down the hall, a heavy oak door standing ajar. Harcourt shoved it open, and the group stopped dead. There, slumped over his desk, was Reginald Harcourt, or what was left of him. Blood stained his shirt, pooling on the desk, a letter opener buried in his chest. His eyes stared blankly, his mouth open in a silent gasp. Clara screamed, burying her face in James's shoulder. Vivian gasped, her hand to her mouth, but her eyes were oddly steady. Pettigrew backed away, muttering, "No, no, this can't be." Mrs. Ellis sobbed, clutching her apron. Miss Marple stepped forward, her face calm but her eyes sharp as needles. The room was small, with bookshelves lining the walls and a single window, its curtains drawn tight. The door had a heavy lock, and it looked undisturbed. A locked room mystery, she thought, like the one in St. Mary Mead when Mr. Safe was robbed, and no one could figure out how the thief got in. "Someone call the police," James said, his voice hoarse. "Now," Mrs. Ellis nodded, running off to the telephone. Miss Marple knelt by the desk, careful not to touch anything. She noticed a faint smelt perfume, sweet and sharp, not Harcourt's. Brandy. She saw a torn scrap of fabric caught on the window latch, dark green, like Mrs. Ellis's apron. And there, on the desk, was a smudge of ink, fresh and wet, like the one on Pettigrew's cuff. "Don't move anything," she said softly. "Standing. We need to wait for the constable." Pettigrew's voice was shrill. "This is madness. Who could have done this?" The door was locked, was it? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild but her eyes fixed on the door. She'd seen locked doors before, in St. Mary Mead, where a clever trick with a string had fooled everyone. She stepped closer, checking the lock. It was heavy, but the key was missing. Odd, she thought. Clara was crying, James holding her tight. "Who would do this?" she whispered. "Why?" Vivian's voice was cool. "People have reasons, darling. Money, love, hate. You know how it is." She glanced at Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing as if sizing her up. Miss Marple didn't react, but she noticed Vivian's sleeve, the loose thread she'd seen earlier, was gone, as if tugged free. She filed that away, her mind working like a loom, weaving the clues. Together, footsteps echoed in the hall, and Inspector Reed burst in. A young man with a serious face and a notebook of his own. "What's happened?" he demanded, his eyes widening at the sight of Harcourt's body. Mrs. Ellis, behind him, was trembling. "I found him like this, sir, right after the scream." Red knelt by the body, checking for a pulse, then shook. "His head, he's gone. Nobody touch anything. I need to know where everyone was when the lights went out." Miss Marple stayed quiet, letting the inspector take charge. She thought of the scream, the darkness, the perfume, the fabric, the ink. She thought of Harcourt's toast, his talk of truth. He'd known something, she was sure of it, and someone in this room hadn't wanted that truth to come out. As Reed began questioning the group, Miss Marple slipped to the edge of the room, her eyes scanning the bookshelves. Something caught her attention, a faint gap behind one shelf, like it wasn't flush against the wall. She didn't touch it, but she remembered a hidden door in St. Mary Mead's old vicarage, used to smuggle stolen goods. Could there be something like that here? The storm raged outside, thunder shaking the manor. The clock ticked toward 8:30, and Miss Marple felt that prickle at the back of her neck again. The night was far from over, and the truth Harcourt had promised was still hiding in the shadows. But she'd find it. She always did. Chapter 4. Suspicions and Alibis. The study at Blackthorn Manor felt like a trap, its air thick with fear and secrets. Rain pounded the windows, and the storm's thunder rumbled, shaking the old house. Miss Jane Marple stood near the bookshelves, her small frame almost lost in the shadows, her grey eyes sharp as she watched Inspector Reed take charge. Reginald Harcourt's body lay slumped over the desk, the letter opener in his chest glinting under the dim light of a single lamp. Blood stained the papers beneath him, and the faint smell of perfume lingered, mixing with the musty scent of old books. It was 8:45 p.m., and the clock on the wall ticked loudly, cutting through the tense silence. Clara Vernon stood by the door, her auburn hair messy, her eyes red from crying. James Thornton, her fiancé, kept an arm around her, his face pale but his jaw set. Mr. Pettigrew, the lawyer, hovered near a chair, his glasses fogged, his hands clutching his notebook. Miss Vivian Lyle leaned against the wall, her red dress bold in the gloom, her face calm but her fingers tapping a slow rhythm. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, stood just outside the door, her apron twisted into knots, her face white as she whispered. To herself, Inspector Reed, a young man with a serious frown, scribbled in his notebook. "Right," he said, his voice firm. "Nobody leaves this room until I get answers. Where were you all when the lights went out and that scream happened?" Miss Marple stayed quiet, her hands folded over her shawl. She thought of a night in St. Mary Mead when a blackout at the village hall had let someone slip a stolen ring into a purse. Darkness hid things, but it also showed things like who moved too fast or stayed too still. She watched the guests, her mind sorting their glances and twitches like pieces of a quilt. Clara spoke first, her voice shaky. "I was in the drawing room, near the sofa. I didn't move when the lights went out. I was too scared." James nodded, his arms still around her. "I was right beside her. I heard the scream and grabbed her hand. We stayed put until the lights came back." Reed wrote that down, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't go anywhere, not even to check the scream." "No," James said, but his voice caught, and Miss Marple noticed his fingers tighten on Clara's arm. She thought of young Tommy Pierce in St. Mary Mead, who'd sworn he was in one place when his muddy shoes told a different story. Pettigrew cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up. "I was in the drawing room, too, by the side table. I dropped my notebook when the lights went out. I was picking it up when I heard the scream." His voice was steady, but his hands shook, and Miss Marple saw that ink smudge on his cuff again, fresh and dark. Vivian's laugh was soft, like a breeze. "I was by the window, darling. I thought the storm was exciting, so I stayed there. The scream startled me, but I didn't run off to play hero." Her eyes flicked to James, and Miss Marple caught a tiny smirk. Vivian's red dress had no loose thread now, but her perfume sweet and sharp matched the scent in the study. Mrs. Ellis, still in the hall, spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "I was in the kitchen, clearing the dessert plates. I heard the scream and ran to the study. That's when I saw him." She choked, tears spilling down her cheeks. Reed nodded, writing it all down. "Right. And the door was locked when you found him?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Ellis said. "I had to use my key to open it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile gentle but her mind racing. A locked door, a scream, a body no one could have gotten in or out, or so it seemed. She Remembered a case in St. Mary Mead when a locked shed had hidden a thief who'd used a hidden panel. She glanced at the bookshelf again, that faint gap catching her eye. Something wasn't right. Reed turned to Miss Marple. "And you, ma'am, where were you?" "Oh, I was in the drawing room, near the fire," she said, her voice soft. "I'm an old lady, Inspector. I don't move fast in the dark." She smiled, but her eyes were on the room, catching every detail. The torn green fabric on the window latch, the ink smudge on the desk, the missing key to the lock. And that perfume Vivian's, she was sure, but why was it so strong here? Reed paced, his boots loud on the wooden floor. So, nobody left. The drawing room except Mrs. Ellis, who was in the kitchen, and yet Mr. Harcourt's dead, stabbed in a locked room. Someone's not telling the truth. Clara sobbed, burying her face in James's shoulder. "It's awful. Who would do this to Uncle?" James's voice was low. Someone who wanted his money. He was talking about changing his will, remember? Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Oh, James, don't point fingers. We all heard him. He was upsetting everyone." Her tone was light, but her eyes were hard, like she was daring him to say more. Pettigrew's voice was sharp. "This is no time for accusations. We need facts, not guesses." But his hands shook as he picked up his notebook, and Miss Marple noticed a tiny tear in his jacket sleeve. Barely visible, Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk, her eyes on the letter opener. It was silver with a fancy handle, the kind used for show more than work. The ink smudge was right beside it, and she thought of Pettigrew's cuff again. She also saw a faint scratch on the desk, like something heavy had been moved. She glanced at the bookshelf, that gap still nagging at her. "Inspector," she said softly, "have you checked the window? It's closed, but that fabric thereon. The latch might tell us something." Reed frowned, crossing to the window. He picked up the green scrap with a handkerchief, holding it up. "Looks like it's from an apron. Mrs. Ellis, is this yours?" Mrs. Ellis gasped, touching her apron. I don't know, sir. Mine's torn, but I didn't notice when." Her voice trailed off, her face pale. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. "Storms make people clumsy, don't they? Easy to catch your clothes on something in the dark." But she was thinking of Mrs. Baxter in St. Mary Mead, who'd torn her dress, hiding a stolen watch. Was Mrs. Ellis hiding something, or was she just scared? Reed turned back to the group. "Let's go over this again." The lights went out at about 8:15, right? The scream came right after. "Mrs. Ellis, how long before you got to the study?" "A minute, maybe 2, she said, her voice trembling. "I was in the kitchen, like I said. I ran when I heard it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. 2 minutes was enough time for someone to move, especially in the dark. She thought of the scream, high and sharp, but not panicked. It felt staged, like something meant to draw attention. She remembered a play in St. Mary Mead, where a girl had screamed to distract from a pickpocket. Was this scream a trick, too? "Inspector," James said, his voice tight. The door was locked. How could anyone get in here? Maybe it was someone from outside. "In this storm," Vivian said, her laugh sharp. "Darling, nobody's climbing through windows in that rain." But her fingers tapped faster, and Miss Marple noticed a slight flush on her cheeks. Reed rubbed his chin. "The window's locked tight, and there's no sign of a break-in. The door's key is missing. Though Mrs. Ellis, where's the spare?" Mrs. Ellis fumbled in her pocket. "It's here, sir. I used it to open the door. It's always in the kitchen drawer. Miss Marple's mind clicked. A missing key, a locked door, a hidden panel. Someone knew this house well. She glanced at Clara, who was still crying, and James, whose eyes kept darting to the door. Pettigrew was writing again, his pen moving too fast. Vivian's calm was cracking, her tapping fingers betraying her nerves. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "perhaps we should check the rest of the room. Old houses like this have surprises. In St. Mary Mead, we once found a secret door behind a bookcase. Thieves used it to sneak in." Reed raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Worth a look. You lot, stay here." He moved to the bookshelf, running his hands along the edges. Miss Marple watched, her heart steady but her mind racing. If there was a panel, it could explain the locked room. But who knew about it? And why the scream? Clara's voice broke the silence. "This is my fault. If I hadn't argued with Uncle, maybe don't be silly," James said, pulling her close. "You didn't do this." Pettigrew's voice was sharp. "Nobody's saying she did. Let's not jump to conclusions." Vivian's eyes flicked to Clara. "Oh, but conclusions are so tempting, aren't they? Harcourt was angry with you." "Dear, that will talk" didn't help. Miss Marple watched them all, her smile soft but her eyes like needles. Clara's tears, James's quick defense, Pettigrew's shaky hands, Vivian's sharp words, they were all pieces of the puzzle. And that perfume, the fabric, the ink, they were threads she'd weaved together. Reed stepped back from the bookshelf, frowning. "Nothing here, but I'll have my men check the whole house. For now, everyone back to the drawing room. Nobody leaves." As the group shuffled out, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the desk. The scratch, the ink, the letter opener, they told a story, but not the whole one. She thought of Harcourt's toast, his talk of truth. Someone in this house had wanted him silent, and they'd used the dark to do it. The clock struck 9 o'clock, the chime echoing through the manor. The storm roared outside, and Miss Marple felt that prickle at the back of her neck. The truth was close, hiding in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor. She'd find it, one clue at a time. Chapter 5. The village paralleled the storm-battered Blackthorn Manor, rain hammering the windows like fists, and thunder rumbling so loud it seemed to shake the old house's bones. Inside, the drawing room was tense, the air thick with fear and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair near the fire, her shawl draped over her lap, her grey eyes sharp despite her gentle smile. It was 9:30 p.m., and the clock's steady ticking cut through the uneasy quiet. Reginald Harcourt's murder in the locked study had left everyone rattled, and Inspector Reed was pacing, his notebook full of scribbled alibis that didn't quite add up. Clara Vernon sat on the sofa, her auburn hair loose, her hands twisting a handkerchief. James Thornton, her fiancé, stood beside her, his face pale but his eyes watchful. Mr. Pettigrew, the lawyer, sat stiffly in a corner, his glasses fogged, his notebook open but untouched. Miss Vivian Lyle lounged by the window, her red dress catching the firelight, her calm mask slipping as her fingers tapped nervously. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, hovered near the door, her apron torn and her face white, looking like she wanted to vanish. Miss Marple sipped her coffee, cold now, and watched them all. She thought of a St. Mary Mead garden party when a sudden fight had revealed a stolen locket hidden in a flower pot. People's nerves, she knew, often gave away their secrets. The scream, the blackout, the locked study, it was a puzzle, but the pieces were starting to fit. The green fabric on the window latch, the ink smudge on Pettigrew's cuff, the faint perfume in the study, they all meant something. She just needed to tug the right thread. Inspector Reed stopped pacing, his voice sharp. I'm waiting for my men to search the house, but I'm not convinced by these alibis. Someone got into that study, and I want to know how. Clara's voice was small. It's impossible, Inspector. The door was locked, the window shut. How could anyone? She trailed off, tears in her eyes. James put a hand on her shoulder. She's right. It doesn't make sense. Maybe someone else was in the house. Vivian's laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. Oh, James, don't be silly. In this storm, nobody's sneaking in from outside. But her eyes flicked to the door, and Miss Marple noticed her fingers pause, then tap faster. Pettigrew adjusted his glasses, his voice thin. We need to stay calm. Wild guesses won't help. The facts are facts, Reed snapped. The fact is, Harcourt's dead, and one of you knows more than you're saying. He turned to Mrs. Ellis. You're sure you used the spare key to open the study? Yes, sir, Mrs. Ellis said, her voice barely a whisper. It was in the kitchen drawer, like always. I ran to the study after the scream and unlocked it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile kind but her mind racing. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, when a locked barn had hidden a thief who'd used a secret trapdoor. The bookshelf in the study, with that faint gap, kept nagging at her, and the scream it had sounded sharp, planned, like a signal. Scoop needed to know more. Mrs. Ellis, Miss Marple said softly, standing and crossing to the housekeeper. You look shaken, dear. Why don't we get some air in the hall? A little chat might calm your nerves. Mrs. Ellis blinked, her hands twisting her apron. Oh, I shouldn't, ma'am. The inspector, nonsense, Miss Marple said, her voice warm but firm. Just a moment. She guided Mrs. Ellis into the hall, away from the other's eyes. The air was cooler here, the chandelier dim, casting long shadows on the wood-panelled walls. Now, dear, Miss Marple said, her tone like a kind aunt. You've been with Mr. Harcourt a long time, haven't you? You must know this house well. Mrs. Ellis nodded, her eyes darting. 10 years, ma'am. It's a big place, full of odd corners. Miss Marple smiled, thinking of Mrs. Baxter in St. Mary Mead, who'd known every secret in her employer's house, but stayed quiet. Of fear. Odd corners can hide things, can't they? Like secrets. I noticed you were nervous tonight, even before the trouble. Was something bothering you? Mrs. Ellis's hands shook. It's just... Mr. Harcourt was in a bad mood lately. He was arguing with Miss Clara about her inheritance. He said she didn't deserve it, that she was too soft. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but sharp. And others. Did he argue with anyone else? Mrs. Ellis hesitated, then whispered, with Miss Vivian. She came to the manor a lot these past weeks, late at night. I heard them talking in the study, about money and promises. I didn't like it, ma'am. She's not what she seems. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. She thought of a St. Mary Mead widow, Mrs. Lane, who'd been charmed by a slick salesman, only to find he'd forged her will. Vivian's perfume in the study, her sharp smiles, it fit a pattern. Thank you, dear, she said. You've been very helpful. Now, why don't you fetch some more coffee? It'll keep us all steady. Mrs. Ellis nodded, hurrying off, her footsteps echoing. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her mind buzzing. She sat quietly, watching the others. Clara was whispering. To James, her face tight. James's eyes kept flicking to Vivian, who was now sipping coffee, her calm back but her fingers still tapping. Pettigrew was writing again, his pen scratching fast. The ink smudge on his cuff catching the light dot. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead case, when a jealous lover had staged a theft to frame a rival. The scream, the blackoutette, felt like a trick, a way to confuse everyone. And the locked study wasn't as locked as it seemed. She needed to check that bookshelf. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "may I look at the study again? Old houses like this have tricks, you know. In St. Mary Mead, we once found a hidden door in a vicarage. It solved a theft." Reed raised an eyebrow but nodded. "All right, but don't touch anything. I'm coming with you," Miss Marple lead. The way her steps, slow but sure. The study was as they'd left it, Harcourt's body still slumped over the desk, the letter opener glinting. The air was heavy with that sweet perfume, stronger now. Reed stood by the door, watching as Miss Marple moved to the bookshelf, her eyes on that faint gap. She ran her fingers lightly along the shelf, not pushing, just feeling. There a slight give, a click. The shelf moved, just an inch, revealing a narrow panel. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm, "look here." A hidden door. Reed's eyes widened. He stepped forward, pushing the shelf gently. It swung open, revealing a dark passage, barely wide enough for one person. "Good grief," he muttered. "This changes everything." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The panel led somewhere, maybe to the hall or another room. Someone could have slipped in, stabbed Harcourt, and slipped out during the blackout. But who, and why the scream? She glanced at the desk again. The ink smudge was still there, next to a scratch mark, like something heavy had been moved. The letter opener had a fancy handle, and she noticed a tiny smudge on it, too ink, like on Pettigrew's cuff. She thought of a St. Mary Mead forger who'd left ink on a stolen check. Was Pettigrew careless, or was someone framing him? "Inspector," she said, "that ink on the desk check, Mr. Pettigrew's cuff. It might match." Reed frowned but nodded, making a note. "I'll look into it. For now, let's get back to the others. This panel means anyone could have gotten in here." They returned to the drawing room, where the tension was thicker than ever. Clara was crying again, James whispering to her. Vivian's eyes followed Miss Marple, her smile tight. Pettigrew's pen stopped, his face pale as he saw Reed's. "Expression, found something," Reed said, his voice grim. "A hidden panel in the study. Someone could have used it to get in and out, even with the door locked." Clara gasped. "You mean someone planned this?" James's voice was hard. "It's got to be someone who knows the house. Who else would know about a secret door?" Vivian's laugh was brittle. "Oh, darling, don't look at me. I'm just a guest, not a treasure hunter." But her fingers gripped her coffee cup too tightly. Pettigrew's voice was shrill. "This is ridiculous. A hidden panel. We're not in a storybook." Miss Marple sat back down, her smile gentle, but her eyes like needles. She thought of Mrs. Lane again, how the salesman had known her house's secrets because he'd charmed the maid. Someone here knew about that panel, Mrs. Ellis, maybe, or someone who'd visited often, like Vivian. And Pettigrew's ink, the perfume, the scream, they were all threads in the same quilt. "Inspector," she said softly, "people don't scream for no reason." That scream was loud, clear, like it was meant to be heard. In St. Mary Mead, a girl once screamed to distract us from a theft. Maybe someone wanted us to run to the study. Reed's eyes narrowed. "You think it was a trick?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "people are cleverer than they seem. but not as clever as they think. The clock struck 9:45, its chime sharp in the quiet room. The storm roared outside, and Miss Marple felt that prickle at the back of her neck. The hidden panel was a big clue, but it wasn't the whole story. Harcourt's talk of truth, his fights with Clara and Vivian, Pettigrew's ink, the torn fabric, they all pointed to something bigger. She'd keep watching, keep listening. The truth was close, and she'd find it before the night was over. Chapter 6. The trap is set. The storm outside Blackthorn Manor roared like an angry beast, rain pounding the windows and thunder shaking the walls. Inside the drawing room, the air was thick with fear, suspicion, and the faint smell of coffee gone cold. It was 10:15 p.m., and the clock's sharp ticks cut through the heavy silence. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, her shawl over her lap, her grey eyes sharp as needles despite her gentle smile. Reginald Harcourt's murder in the locked study had turned the night upside down, and the discovery of a hidden panel behind the bookshelf had cracked the mystery wide open. But the truth was still hiding, and Miss Marple knew it was close. Inspector Reed paced near the fireplace, his notebook tucked under his arm, his face set in a grim frown. Clara Vernon sat on the sofa, her auburn hair tangled, her hands clutching James Thornton's arm. James's face was pale, his eyes darting to the door like he expected someone to burst in. Mr. Pettigrew, the lawyer, sat stiffly in a corner, his glasses slipping down his nose, his ink-stained cuff hidden under his sleeve. Miss Vivian Lyle stood by the window, her red dress glowing in the firelight, her fingers no longer tapping but gripping the curtain. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, lingered by the door, her torn apron twisted in her hands, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple sipped her cold coffee, her mind weaving clues like threads in a quilt. The green fabric on the window latch, the ink smudge on Pettigrew's cuff, the sweet perfume in the study, the hidden panel, they all pointed to something bigger than a simple murder. She thought of a St. Mary Mead dance when a staged fight had distracted everyone while a thief slipped away. The scream and blackout felt like that, a trick to hide the real crime. But who was the thief and who was the puppet master? Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, this hidden panel changes things, doesn't it? Someone could have slipped into the study, stabbed poor Mr. Harcourt, and slipped out, all in the dark. But that scream, it was so loud, so clear, almost like it was meant to pull us to the study. Reed stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. You think it was planned? To cover something up? Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind. In St. Mary Mead, we had a girl who screamed during a play to hide a stolen purse. People run toward a scream, don't they? It leaves other places empty. Clara's voice was shaky. You mean someone wanted us to find Uncle like that? James frowned, his arm tightening around Clara. That's sick. Who would do something so twisted? Vivian's laugh was sharp, like a knife. Oh, darling, people do all sorts of things for money, or love, or hate. Her eyes flicked to James, then to Miss Marple, as if testing her. Pettigrew cleared his throat, his voice thin. This is all guesswork. We need evidence, not stories. But his hand shook, and Miss Marple noticed he kept his cuff tucked under his sleeve. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes gentle but piercing. She thought of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper, Mr. Bates, who'd staged a robbery to cover his debts. The blackout, the scream, the locked room, it felt like a stage, and someone was playing a part. She needed to shake things up, to see who slipped. Inspector, she said. What if we tried something? In my village, we once reenacted a theft to catch a liar. People act differently when they're surprised. Could we try the blackout again? Turn off the lights, just for a moment, and see what happens. Reed raised an eyebrow, but his face softened. You're full of ideas, Miss Marple. All right, let's do it. Everyone, stay exactly where you are. Mrs. Ellis, can you cut the lights? Mrs. Ellis nodded, her face pale, and hurried to the hall. The group tensed, their eyes darting. Clara gripped James's hand, her knuckles white. Vivian's fingers tightened on the curtain. Pettigrew's pen dropped, clattering. On the floor, Miss Marple sat still, her heart steady but her senses sharp. Like a cat watching a mouse. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The fire's glow cast flickering shadows, and the storm's roar filled the silence. Miss Marple listened, her ears catching every sound, a rustle of fabric, a quick breath, a soft creak. Then, a faint thud, like someone moving fast. Stay put. Reed's voice boomed, but it was too late. The lights flicked back on, and Miss Marple's eyes snapped to the room. Clara and James were still on the sofa, but James's chair was pushed back, his hand no longer on Clara's. Vivian stood by the window, but her curtain was pulled aside, as if she'd moved to look out. Pettigrew was fumbling for his pen, his face flushed. Mrs. Ellis stood by the door, her apron twisted tighter. Where's Thornton? Reed barked, his eyes on James. I'm right here, James said, his voice tight. I just shifted. The dark startled me. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She'd heard that thud, and James's chair was too far back for a simple shift. She thought of a St. Mary Mead boy, caught sneaking out because his shoes left mud. James's shoes were clean, but his quick movement meant something. Inspector, she said softly, did you notice anyone moving toward the hall? That thud sounded like someone heading for the study. Reed's eyes flicked to the door. Nobody left the room, but let's check. He strode to the hall, Miss Marple following, her steps light but quick. The study door was still ajar, architect body untouched. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something new, a faint scuff mark on the floor near the hidden panel, like someone had pushed it open. Someone was here, she said, pointing. Just now. Reed knelt, examining the mark. Fresh. Thornton, you said you didn't move. I didn't. James snapped, but his voice cracked, and Clara looked at him, her eyes wide. Miss Marple turned to the group, now gathered in the hall. In St. Mary Mead, we caught a thief because he moved when he shouldn't have. People act on instinct in the dark, don't they? They go where they feel safe or where they're hiding something. Vivian's voice was cool. Very clever, Miss Marple. But what does it prove? We're all jumpy tonight. Her perfume was strong again, and Miss Marple noticed a tiny bead of sweat on her forehead. Pettigrew's voice was shrill. This is nonsense. You're accusing us based on nothing. But his hand shook, and Miss Marple saw his cuff again, the ink smudged darker now, like he'd brushed against something wet. Mrs. Ellis whispered, I didn't see anyone leave, ma'am. I was by the switch. Miss Marple nodded, her smile. Kind, of course, dear. But old houses have many paths, don't they? She thought of the hidden panel, how it could lead to the hall or another room. James's movement, Vivian's perfume, Pettigrew's ink, they were all connected, she was sure, but not in the way everyone thought. This wasn't one killer. She suspected it was a team, a conspiracy. Inspector, she said, have you checked Mr. Pettigrew's notebook? Ink can tell stories, you know. In St. Mary Mead, a forger was caught because his pen leaked. Reed's eyes lit up. Good idea, Pettigrew. Let's see that notebook. Pettigrew's face went white. This is private. You can't now, Reed said, his voice hard. Pettigrew handed it over, his hands shaking. Reed flipped through it, pausing at a page with fresh ink, smudged like the mark on the desk. This matches the study. Care to explain? I was writing earlier, Pettigrew stammered. I must have touched the desk. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Vivian, whose calm was cracking, her fingers now still. That perfumit was too strong in the study, too fresh. And James's quick move in the dark toward the study. She thought of a St. Mary Mead couple who'd worked together to hide a theft, one distracting while the other acted. Was that happening here? Inspector, she said, that scream, did it sound like fear to you, or something else? In my village, a scream once hid a bigger plan. Maybe someone wanted us to run to the study while something else happened. Reed frowned, nodding. You're saying the scream was a distraction? Exactly, Miss Marple said. And distractions need two people, one to scream, one to act. Clara gasped. You mean a plot? But who? James's face darkened. Don't look at me. I was with Clara the whole time. Vivian's laugh was forced. Oh, Miss Marple, you're spinning. Quite a tale. Next, you'll say we're all in on it. But her eyes were nervous, and Miss Marple caught a glance between her and Pettigrew. Quick but telling. Miss Marple sat back down, her hands folded, her mind buzzing. The reenactment had worked it, had shaken them, shown their cracks. James knew the panel, she was sure, from his quick move. Vivian's perfume placed her in the study. Pettigrew's ink tied him to the murder weapon. And Mrs. Ellis's fear she knew something, maybe about the house's secrets. This wasn't one person, Miss Marple thought. It was a pair, maybe more, working together to silence Harcourt. The clock struck 10:30, its chime echoing through the manor. The storm outside howled, and the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. Miss Marple felt that prickle at the back of her neck, the same one she'd felt in St. Mary Mead when she'd caught a liar by watching their hands. The truth was close, hiding in the glances, the smells, the sounds. She'd set the trap, and now she'd wait to see who fell in. Chapter 7. The motive unraveled. The storm raged outside Blackthorn Manor, its thunder shaking the old house and rain hammering the windows like a drum. Inside the drawing room, the air was heavy with suspicion, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was 11 p.m., and the clock's sharp ticks echoed like a heartbeat. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair near the fire, her shawl over her lap, her grey eyes sharp as she watched the guests. Reginald Harcourt's murder in the locked study had turned the night into a puzzle, and the pieces, ink, perfume, a hidden panel, a scream were finally coming together. Inspector Reed stood by the mantel, his notebook open, his face tense. Clara Vernon sat on the sofa, her auburn hair loose, her hands clutching a handkerchief, her eyes red from crying. James Thornton, her fiancé, stood close, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to the door. Mr. Pettigrew, the lawyer, sat in a corner, his glasses fogged, his ink-stained cuff tucked under his sleeve. Miss Vivian Lyle leaned against the window, her red dress bold in the dim light, her calm mask cracking as her fingers gripped the curtain. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, hovered by the door, her torn apron twisted, her face pale. Miss Marple sipped her cold coffee, her mind weaving the clues like threads in a quilt. The reenactment of the blackout had shaken them. James's quick move, Vivian's nervous glance, Pettigrew's shaking hands, the fresh scuff mark by the hidden panel. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, when a pair of lovers had staged a theft to hide their affair. This murder felt like that, a team effort, not a lone act. The scream, the blackout, the locked room, they were all part of a plan. And Miss Marple was close to unravelling it. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear, "this murder wasn't a sudden act. It was planned, like a play. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a couple who worked together to fool everyone. One distracted, the other acted. I think we have something like that here." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You're saying more than one person did this?" "Who?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes moving from face to face. "Let's start with the clues. The ink on Mr. Pettigrew's cuff matches the smudge on the desk near the letter opener. The perfume. In the study it's Miss Vivian's, strong and fresh, like she was there. The hidden panel explains the locked room, but someone had to know it was there. And the scream, it wasn't fear, Inspector. It was a signal to pull us to the study, while something else happened." Clara gasped, her hand to her mouth. "You mean they planned it together?" James's voice was sharp. "That's crazy. Why would anyone team up to kill him?" Vivian's laugh was brittle. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're quite the storyteller. But you've got no proof, darling." Her voice was smooth, but her eyes were nervous, and Miss Marple saw her grip tighten on the curtain. Pettigrew pushed his glasses up, his face pale. "This is absurd. My cuff got ink because I was writing, and Miss Lyle's perfume, lots of women wear it. You're making leaps." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile gentle. "In St. Mary Mead, we caught a forger because his ink gave him away, and perfume, Mr. Pettigrew, it lingers, but not that strong unless you're close to the source. Miss Vivian was in the study, I'm sure of it. And you, with that ink, you handled the letter opener, didn't you?" Pettigrew's mouth opened, but no words came out. Reed stepped forward, his voice hard. "Pettigrew, show me your cuff again." Pettigrew hesitated, then pulled back his sleeve, revealing the dark ink smudge. Reed compared it to his notebook. Sketch of the desk smudge. "It's a match," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." I don't know," Pettigrew stammered. "I was in the drawing room, like I said." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Vivian, who was watching. Pettigrew, her face tight. She thought of Mrs. Lane in St. Mary Mead, whose lover had forged papers to steal her savings. Pettigrew and Vivian, there was a connection, she was sure. "Inspector," she said, "Mrs. Ellis told me Mr. Harcourt was arguing with Miss Vivian about money and promises, and with Clara about her inheritance. What if someone wanted to stop him from changing his will?" Clara's eyes widened. "You think they killed Uncle to keep his money?" Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Harcourt said he was changing his will, cutting you out, Clara. But what if he'd found something else, something dangerous? In St. Mary Mead, a man was killed because he caught his accountant stealing. Mr. Pettigrew, you managed Mr. Harcourt's money, didn't you?" Pettigrew's face went white. I did my job. I never stole anything." Reed's voice was sharp. "We'll check your books, Pettigrew. But first, let's see that notebook again. You've been scribbling all night." Pettigrew clutched his notebook, but Red snatched it, flipping through the pages. He stopped, his eyes widening. "This isn't just notes. It's a draft of a Will Harcourt's will, but it's different. It names Miss Lyle as the main heir, Vivian Laugh was forced. That's ridiculous. I'm just an actress, not a heiress. But her hands shook, and Miss Marple saw a glance pass between her and Pettigrew. Quick and guilty, but Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. Inspector, check Mr. Pettigrew's briefcase. In St. Mary Mead, we found a thief's plan hidden in his bag. People keep their secrets close. Reed nodded, grabbing Pettigrew's briefcase from the corner. Pettigrew lunged forward. That's private. But Reed opened it, pulling out a folded paper. He unfolded it, his face hardening. It's a forged will, dated today. It leaves everything to Vivian Lyle, signed by Harcourt, but the signature looks wrong. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. She thought of the St. Mary Mead forger, caught because his pen leaked. Mr. Pettigrew was stealing from Mr. Harcourt, wasn't he? And Mr. Harcourt found out. That's why he talked about truth, why he was changing his will. He was going to expose you. Pettigrew's voice was shrill. You've got no proof. This is slander. Vivian stepped forward, her voice smooth but shaky. Darling, you're barking up the wrong tree. I barely knew Reginald's business. I was just a friend. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A friend who visited late at night, Mrs. Ellis said. A friend whose perfume was in the study. And Mr. Pettigrew, your ink ties you to the murder weapon. You two worked together, didn't you? You, Mr. Pettigrew, stabbed him through the hidden panel. Miss Vivian screamed to distract us, to make us think it was a sudden crime. Clara's voice broke. You mean they planned to frame me? Miss Marple nodded. In St. Mary Mead, a jealous wife framed her rival by leaving clues to point at her. Your uncle's talk of cutting you out, claret was perfect for them. They wanted you blamed, so no one looked at them. James's face darkened. You monsters. Clara's done nothing but care for him. Vivian's calm cracked. This is nonsense. You're an old lady with too many stories. But her eyes were wild, and she stepped back, closer to Pettigrew Reed's. Voice was grim. Miss Lyle, your perfume's in the study. Pettigrew, your ink's on the weapon. And this forged will, it's enough to hold you both. But let's hear it. Why'd you do it? Pettigrew's shoulders slumped, his glasses slipping. I didn't mean to. He was going to ruin me. He found out I'd taken money amounts to cover debts. He was going to tell everyone, change the will. I had to stop him. Vivian's voice was sharp. Don't drag me into this, you fool. But her face was pale, and Miss Marple saw her hand slip behind her, like she was hiding something. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but cutting. Miss Vivian, you helped him. You screamed to cover his move through the panel. You wanted the money, to his fortune, through that forged will. You've been close to Mr. Pettigrew, haven't you? In St. Mary Mead, a couple once hid there. Affair behind a crime. You thought you'd get away with it. Vivian's eyes flashed, but her voice broke. You can't prove any of this. Reed stepped forward, holding up the forged will. This is proof enough. And we'll test that perfume. Check the panel for prints. You two are coming with me. Pettigrew tried to run, darting for the door, but Reed grabbed him, pinning his arms. Vivian screamed, not staged this time, and sank to the floor, her red dress pooling like blood. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she sobbed. We just wanted the money. Clara burst into tears, and James pulled her close, his face a mix of relief and anger. Mrs. Ellis, still by the door, whispered, "Thank goodness." Her hands finally still. Miss Marple sat back, her heart steady but her mind clear. The puzzle was solved, the threads woven into a clear picture. Pettigrew had been stealing, Harcourt had found out, and Vivian, his lover, had helped silence him. James had been a pawn. His knowledge of the panel used to confuse things. The scream, the blackout, the forged willet was all to frame Clara and secure the fortune. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, "you might check Mr. Pettigrew's briefcase for more papers. And Miss Vivian's handbag there might be something interesting." Reed nodded, already searching. He pulled a small vial of perfume from Vivian's bag, the same sweet scent, and a note in Pettigrew's briefcase outlining their plan. It was enough. The clock struck 11:15, its chime soft but final. The storm outside was easing, the rain slowing to a patter. Miss Marple folded her hands, her smile gentle. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where truth always came out, no matter how clever the lie. Harcourt's murder was solved, the guilty caught, and Clara safe. The night wasn't over, but the truth was out, just as Harcourt had wanted. Chapter 8. Justice in the moonlight. The storm over Blackthorn Manor had softened, its wild roars now a low grumble, with rain tapping gently against the windows. Inside the drawing room, the air was thick with the weight of truth, the fires glow casting soft shadows on the walls. It was 11:45 p.m., and the clock's steady ticks felt like a countdown to the end of a long, dark night. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair near the fire, her shawl draped over her lap, her grey eyes calm, but sharp as she watched the room. Reginald Harcourt's murder had been unravelled, its thread-zinc perfume, a hidden panel, a scream woven into a clear picture of greed and betrayal. Inspector Reed stood by the door, his face stern, holding Mr. Pettigrew's briefcase and Miss Vivian Lyle's handbag. Pettigrew was slumped in a chair, his glasses askew, his ink-stained cuff exposed, his hands cuffed behind him by a constable who'd just arrived. Vivian sat on the floor, her red dress crumpled, her golden curls messy, her face pale as she stared at the ground. Clara Vernon sat on the sofa, her auburn hair loose, her eyes still wet but wide with relief. James Thornton stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face a mix of anger and gratitude. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her torn apron still but her eyes bright with hope. Miss Marple set her cold coffee down, her voice soft but clear. "It's a sad thing, isn't it, how greed can twist people? In St. Mary Mead, I saw a young man steal from his own mother for a quick fortune. This is no different. Mr. Harcourt was killed to hide a secret, and two people thought they could outsmart us all." Clara's voice was shaky. "Miss Marple, you're sure it was them? Mr. Pettigrew and Miss Vivian?" Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle. "Quite sure, dear. Let me explain, so it's clear." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting each person's, her voice steady like a teacher telling a story. Mr. Harcourt was a sharp man. He found out Mr. Pettigrew was stealing from him small sums at first, but enough to matter. Mr. Pettigrew was scared. If Harcourt told anyone, he'd lose everything: his job, his reputation, maybe even his freedom. Pettigrew's head jerked up, his voice shrill. "You've got no proof. It's all guesses." Inspector Reed held up the forged will from Pettigrew's briefcase, his voice hard. "This isn't a guess, Pettigrew. It's your handwriting, naming Miss Lyle as Harcourt's heir. And this note," he pulled out a crumpled paper. "It's your plan, step by step. You can't talk your way out of this." Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but firm. "Mr. Pettigrew couldn't let Harcourt expose him, so he planned to kill him, but he needed help. That's where Miss Vivian came in. She'd been visiting Mr. Harcourt late at night, charming him, maybe promising things to get into his will. But Harcourt wasn't fooled. He was going to cut her out, too, along with Clara. Isn't that right, Miss Vivian? Vivian's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. You're a meddling old woman. I didn't do anything. But her voice cracked, and her hands shook, betraying her. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but unyielding. In St. Mary Mead, we had a woman who used her charm to trick a lonely man. You screamed that night, Miss Vivian, to distract us. You stood by the window, making sure we all heard it, while Mr. Pettigrew slipped through the hidden panel in the study. He stabbed Mr. Harcourt with the letter opener, leaving that ink smudge from his cuff. Your perfume was in the study because you were there earlier, checking the panel, making sure the plan would work. James's voice was low, angry. You tried to frame Clara, didn't you? Make it look like she killed him over the will. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly, James. Harcourt's talk of cutting Clara out was perfect for them. They wanted the police to think she had a motive. The locked room, the scream it, was all to confuse us, to make it seem like a sudden crime. But they weren't as clever as they thought. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Why, Miss Vivian, Uncle trusted you. Vivian. Face crumpled, and she sobbed, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to hurt him. It was Pettigrew's idea. He said we'd split the money, live like kings. I just wanted a better life. Pettigrew shouted, don't pin it all on me. You were in on it from the start. Reed stepped forward, his voice like iron. Enough. You're both under arrest. My men will take you to the station. He nodded to the constable, who pulled Pettigrew to his feet. Another officer helped Vivian up, her sobs echoing as they led her out. Mrs. Ellis stepped forward, her voice soft. Miss Marple, I can't thank you enough. I knew something was wrong, but I was too scared to speak. You saved us. Miss Marple smiled, patting her hand. You helped, dear, by telling me about those late-night visits. In St. Mary Mead, it's often the quiet ones who see the most. Clara stood, her face still pale, but her eyes clear. Miss Marple, I thought they'd blame me. I was so scared. She turned to James, her voice breaking. And I thought you might have known something with how you moved in the dark. James's face softened, and he pulled her close. I'm sorry, Clara. I knew about the panel, found it years ago, playing in the manor as a kid. I moved in the blackout because I was scared someone was setting you up. I wanted to check the study, make sure you were safe. Miss Marple, Miss Marple no detto. Her smile gentle. In St. Mary Mead, we had a boy who kept secrets to protect his love. It's not uncommon, James. You wanted to help Clara, but you should have trusted the police. James nodded, his cheeks red. I know, I was CR's, broke down. I panicked. Clara hugged him, her tears falling. It's over now, James. We're safe. Miss Marple's voice was warm. It's all right, dear. You were caught in a terrible moment, but the truth is out, and justice is done. The clock struck 11:45, its chime soft but final. The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle, and moonlight peeked through the clouds, casting a pale glow into the room. Miss Marple felt a wave of calm, the puzzle solved at last. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where truth always found a way out, no matter how dark the night. Inspector, she said, you'll find that key to the study, won't you? It's still missing. Reed nodded, his face grim but grateful. We'll search the house top to bottom. You've done enough for one night, Miss Marple. I don't know how you saw it all so clearly." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I just watch people, Inspector. They tell their own stories, if you know how to look." As the constables led Pettigrew and Vivian out, the room seemed to breathe again. Clara and James sat close, whispering, their hands clasped. Mrs. Ellis brought a tray of tea, her hands steady now, and set it on the table. "You've saved us, Miss Marple," she said. "The manor feels lighter already." Miss Marple took a cup, her heart warm. "It's just a matter of noticing, dear. People are never as clever as they think." The room fell quiet, and the fire crackled softly. Miss Marple looked out the window, where the moon hung low, its light silver and clean. Justice had been done, and Blackthorn Manor could rest. She thought of Harcourt's toast, his call for truth. He'd gotten his wish, in the end, and she hoped that brought him peace. Epilogue. The quiet returned, the storm had passed, leaving St. Mary Mead cloaked in a soft, silver moonlight that spilled across the village's quiet streets. It was just past midnight, and Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage, the familiar creak of her armchair a comfort after the long, dark night at Blackthorn Manor. The fire in her grate crackled gently, casting a warm glow over the room where lace curtains fluttered at the open window. Her knitting lay in her lap, a pale blue scarf half finished, but her hands were still for now, resting over the soft wool. She sipped a cup of tea, its steam curling in the cool air, and let her mind wander over the events of the evening. The drive back from Blackthorn Manor had been silent. The young driver from earlier focused on the slick roads. Miss Marple had gazed out the car window, watching the moon break through the clouds, its light glinting on puddles left by the storm. The manor's grim secrets, Reginald Harcourt's murder, the conspiracy between Mr. Pettigrew and Miss Vivian Lyle, the forged will meant to frame Clara had all been laid bare. Justice had been served, the guilty taken away in handcuffs, and Clara and James left to rebuild their trust. Yet, as always, Miss Marple felt a quiet sadness, a weight that came with seeing the worst in people. Even as she brought truth to light, she set her teacup on the small table beside her, its delicate china clinking softly. The cottage was peaceful, a stark contrast to the manor's heavy air. Her garden outside, visible through the window, was a tangle of roses and lavender, their shapes soft in the moonlight. She thought of St. Mary Mead, her little village, where every face held a story, and every story held a lesson. Tonight's mystery had been bigger, darker, but it wasn't so different from the small dramas she'd unravelled. Herristowen ring, a forged letter, a whispered lie. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her fingers moving slowly, the needles clicking like the clock at Blackthorn Manor. She thought of Mr. Pettigrew, his ink-stained cuff betraying his greed, and Miss Vivian, her sharp smile hiding a heart hungry for wealth. They'd thought their plan was clever, using the hidden panel, staging the scream, forging the will to point at Clara. But they hadn't counted on an old lady who noticed the little things. A smudge of ink, a whiff of perfume, a torn scrap of fabric. In St. Mary Mead, she'd caught a thief because of a muddy footprint, and tonight those same small clues had undone a murder. Her mind drifted to Clara. Poor Clara, who'd been so scared, thinking she'd be blamed for her uncle's death. Miss Marple smiled, remembering the girl's tears turning to relief as James held her close. They'd been caught in a web not of their making, their love tested by suspicion. James's quick move in the blackout had worried her at first, but his confession he'd known the panel from childhood games and wanted to protect Clara had cleared the air. They'd left the manor hand in hand, their bond stronger for it. Miss Marple thought of a young couple in St. Mary Mead who'd overcome a lie to find trust again. Love, she knew, could survive a storm if the roots were deep. Mrs. Ellis, too, had found peace. The housekeeper's fear had been real, her torn apron and trembling hands telling a story of loyalty mixed with dread. She'd known the manners. Secrets Vivian's, late-night visits. Harcourt's fights with Pettigrew. She'd been too scared to speak until Miss Marple's gentle questions had drawn her out. Miss Marple remembered Mrs. Baxter, a St. Mary Mead housekeeper who'd whispered about her employer's stolen silver, helping catch a thief. Quiet people, she thought, often held the key to truth. If you listened closely, the fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. She thought of Inspector Reed, young and serious, but sharp enough to follow her lead. He'd been skeptical at first, but the forged will, the ink, the perfume they'd convinced him. He'd promised to search for the missing study key, and she was sure he'd find it, maybe in Pettigrew's pocket or Vivian's bag. In St. Mary Mead, a lost key had once unlocked a mystery, and she trusted Reed to tie up the loose ends. Her knitting needles paused, and she looked at the scarf, its soft blue loops, neat and even. It was for her nephew's wife, a Christmas gift. Though winter was months away, she liked planning ahead, just as she liked puzzling out people's secrets. Tonight had been a challenge, but not so different from her village. Blackthorn Manor, with its grand walls and hidden panel, was just a bigger stage for the same old storied lies, and the truth that always came out in the end. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the warmth soothing her throat. She thought of Reginald Harcourt, his stern face and his toast to truth. He'd known someone was betraying him, and he'd invited her to the manor, perhaps hoping she'd see what he couldn't prove. She felt a pang for him, a man who'd died for his honesty. But his wish had been granted, the truth had come. Out, just as he'd wanted, before the night was over. The moonlight outside grew brighter, painting the garden in silver. Miss Marple thought of a night in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a petty theft had seemed like the end of the world. A boy had stolen apples from a neighbour's tree, and the village had buzzed with gossip. She'd solved it by noticing his sticky fingers and a torn shirt, much like the torn fabric in the manor's study. Small things, always the small things, led to the truth. She set her knitting down and stood, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the wooden floor. Crossing to the window, she looked out at the village, its cottages dark and quiet. St. Mary Mead was her home, her school, where every quarrel, every whisper taught her about people. Blackthorn Manor had been a test, but she'd passed it, using the lessons of her village to untangle a murder. She smiled, her heart light. The world was full of mysteries, but none too big for an old lady with sharp eyes and a knack for listening. The clock on her mantel chimed midnight, its soft notes filling the room. Miss Marple closed the window, the night air cool against her skin. She thought of Clara and James, starting fresh, and Mrs. Ellis, free from fear. She thought of Pettigrew and Vivian facing justice for their greed, and she thought of Harcourt, his truth shining in the moonlight, even if he hadn't lived to see it. Returning to her chair, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking again. The scarf grew, loop by loop, just as the truth had grown. Clue by clue, she felt a quiet pride, not for herself, but for the village that had taught her so much. St. Mary Mead was small, but its lessons were big, and they'd carried her through the darkest night. Miss Marple sipped her tea, now cool, and let her eyes close for a moment. The fire crackled, the moonlight glowed, and the village slept. Tomorrow she'd walk to the post office, chat with Mrs. Price about the weather, and listen for the next whisper of a mystery. For now, though the night was done, the puzzle solved, and her cottage was peaceful. She smiled, her heart as warm as the fire, and knitted on, ready for whatever St. Mary Madore the world brought next.